There is a bird that has visited your yard every spring for years, and maybe you've noticed it. Same species, same corner of the yard, same feeder. And at some point you probably wondered whether it was actually the same individual coming back or whether you were just seeing what you wanted to see. The answer is yes, it is almost certainly the same bird. But the reason it keeps coming back and what it actually knows about your yard is so much stranger than most people realize. Welcome to Amazing Nature Now. If you're new here, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment, because what you are about to learn will change the way you look at birds you swore you've seen around before. This video is about site fidelity, the scientific term for why birds return to the same locations year after year. Most backyard bird content treats this as a sweet fact and moves on. We're not going to do that because when you dig into the actual research, what you find is a stack of mechanisms that are genuinely bizarre. Brain tissue that grows and shrinks with the seasons. Two completely separate magnetic senses running at the same time. The possibility that your bird isn't picturing your yard at all. It might be smelling it. By the end of this, you're going to understand something about the bird outside your window that most people who have been feeding birds for decades have never heard. Let's start with the thing that flips the whole idea on its head. Most people assume that a bird returning to their yard is coming home, like it hatched there, grew up there, and keeps gravitating back because of some deep instinct tied to where it was born. That's not what's happening. In most species, juvenile birds disperse once. They leave their birthplace, fly to a new area, pick a territory, and then that's it. That one choice, made as a young adult, becomes permanent. After that first settlement, many birds show what researchers call lifelong fidelity to that single location. So the bird that keeps showing up in your yard almost certainly wasn't born there. It found your yard once, probably in its first year, decided your yard was worth betting on, and has been coming back to that same bet ever since. That framing a bet is actually how ecologists describe this behavior. Site fidelity isn't loyalty in any emotional sense. It's closer to a calculated gamble that the bird keeps replaying. Ecological theory on this is pretty clear. If a bird had a good outcome in a location, it's more likely to return. If it had a bad outcome, it's more likely to try somewhere new. Your yard isn't sentimental to the bird, it's a known quantity. The bird is essentially saying, "This place worked before, and I'd rather repeat a known result than roll the dice on something unfamiliar." But here's what makes this more interesting than it sounds. Return rates across species are nowhere near as consistent as people assume. A large-scale analysis covering 111 bird populations across 49 species found that the proportion of marked birds returning to the same site the following year ranged from 0% to 100%. 0 to 100. There's no universal rule that birds come back. Site fidelity is a per-species, sometimes per-individual behavior that varies enormously depending on the bird, the habitat, and what happened last time. So when your bird does come back, that's not a given. It's a choice, and it means your yard passed the test. And the longer a bird has been alive, the more locked in that relationship becomes. Long-term studies on terns found that the tendency to return to the same nest site actually increases with age. White stork research found the same pattern. Older birds show stronger fidelity tied to their age, their breeding history, and the quality of the territory they've claimed. So if you have a bird that's been coming back for several years, you're not just seeing habit, you're seeing a bird that has accumulated enough experience to know exactly what it has and has decided it's not worth giving up. That's important, but if you don't also understand what's happening inside the bird's brain when it does this, you're missing the part that's genuinely hard to believe. This is where it gets strange. In food-storing species, chickadees, nuthatches, the birds most likely to be regulars at your feeder, memory for specific locations depends on a brain structure called the hippocampus. And researchers have found that the hippocampus in these birds doesn't stay the same size year-round. It grows. The number of new neurons recruited into it and its total volume both shift seasonally, peaking in fall and winter when catching is at its heaviest. The bird that's visiting your feeder in November has a physically larger memory center than it did in July. That's not a metaphor for being more alert. That's literal brain tissue added in response to the cognitive demand of remembering hundreds of specific locations. and some birds have better memories than others because of where they evolved. Mountain chickadees living at higher elevations where winters are brutal and food caches are the difference between surviving and not show better spatial learning, a larger hippocampus and more hippocampal neurons than chickadees from milder climates at lower elevations. That difference is heritable. It's been shaped by generations of harsh winters, selecting for birds that could remember more. So depending on where your bird came from, it may have a genuinely superior memory for your yard compared to a bird of the same species from a more forgiving climate. The whole concept of birds returning to specific sites, by the way, was documented almost 2 centuries before anyone had a scientific framework for it. John James Audubon, in the early 1800s, tied silver threads to the legs of eastern phoebes nesting near his Pennsylvania home. The following spring, some of those same birds came back, identifiable by the threads, to the same nesting site. It was the first documented evidence of breeding site fidelity in North America, and it happened by accident on one of the most ordinary birds you could imagine. Audubon wasn't trying to prove a theory, he was just curious. The birds proved it for him. More recently, a hummingbird bander documented a rufous hummingbird that returned to the same yard in Alpharetta, Georgia, for 5 consecutive years. The only reason they knew it was the same individual was a tiny numbered leg band. And that same yard hosted multiple different rufous hummingbirds across those years, meaning the location itself had become a beacon. Different birds from different populations all converging on the same spot year after year, as if the yard had a reputation. Now, how does a hummingbird find the same yard in Georgia after spending months in Mexico or the Pacific coast? This is where the navigation question gets genuinely weird, and most backyard bird content never touches it. The popular answer is that birds use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate, which is true, but it's not one system. It appears to be 2 completely separate systems running at the same time. The first is in the eye. There's a protein called cryptochrome in the bird's retina that reacts to light in a way that's sensitive to magnetic field lines. This gives the bird something like a compass sense, an awareness of direction based on the angle of the magnetic field. And some researchers think this may actually appear to the bird as a visual overlay, a kind of directional tint or pattern superimposed on what it sees. The second system is entirely separate. Magnetite-based receptors in the beak detect magnetic intensity rather than direction, and that signal travels through a completely different nerve to a completely different part of the brain, direction and location, processed independently, simultaneously. Your bird may effectively see which way it's going and feel where it is as 2 unrelated senses that it somehow integrates into a single navigation picture. But there's a third possibility that almost no one talks about, and it might actually be the most important one for explaining how a bird finds your specific yard rather than just your general neighborhood. The leading explanation for long-distance avian navigation in pigeons, the most studied navigators we have, isn't visual landmarks, and it isn't the magnetic field, it's smell. Pigeons appear to build a map of the world based on atmospheric odors, learning the characteristic scent signature of their home location and how that signature shifts depending on wind direction. When researchers surgically removed pigeons' ability to smell, those birds lost the ability to navigate home. Not partially, they lost it. The magnetic senses could still tell them which way was north, but without smell they couldn't find home. Now apply that to your yard. Your yard has a specific smell, the particular mix of plants, soil, water, seed, and air that makes your yard yours. If birds are using olfactory maps the way pigeon research suggests, then the bird coming back to your yard every spring might not be picturing your yard. It might be following a scent trail that ends at your fence line. That's a completely different kind of memory than anyone imagines when they think about a bird remembering where to go. So what does your bird actually remember about you specifically? Here's the honest answer. The bird returning to your yard probably doesn't distinguish you from other humans in the way a crow would. Crows are a special case with facial recognition that's been well documented. But what your regular visitors do have is a detailed spatial and sensory memory of your yard as a system. They know where the feeder is, they know the escape routes, they know the cover, they know the timing of when food appears, and research has shown that birds develop anticipatory behavior around specific locations and the patterns associated with them. If you're the one who fills the feeder, your presence becomes part of the pattern the bird has memorized, not your face necessarily, but your timing, your movement, your role in the system. And that relationship deepens every year the bird comes back. The older the bird gets, the more committed it becomes to that specific location. The bet that started as a young adult's first territory choice becomes, over years, something the bird will not give up without a very good reason. If you've been watching the same bird come back to your yard and you've always wondered whether it actually knew where it was going, it did. It had a map built from magnetic fields and possibly smell. It had a brain that grew new tissue to hold the memory of your yard through the winter. It made a calculated decision years ago that your yard was worth returning to. And every spring it comes back, it's not being sentimental. It's just confirming what it already decided. That's actually more interesting than loyalty, if you think about it. Loyalty is easy. Choosing the same place year after year based on evidence, that's something else. And if you have a bird that comes back every year and you've never been sure whether it was the same individual, drop that in the comments. The bird outside your window right now has a more sophisticated relationship with your yard than most people ever realize. It found you once, decided you were worth it, and has been carrying a memory of your yard in its brain, in its senses, possibly in its nose, through thousands of miles and back again. That's not nothing. That's actually remarkable.